Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line. The Russians managed to advance within the Chernihiv region, as well as several areas within the Donetsk region where they have managed to advance from the southwestern outskirts to the northeastern outskirts of the region. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to advance closer towards the town of Vilnopole from the south, following the capture of the area surrounding Novosilka to the north, west, and south. Securing the area around it, the Russians are now moving upwards towards Vilnopole from the south. They already have a foothold in the eastern parts of the town. Attacking it from the west will further isolate the town and allow for a second entry into it, where the Russians can spread out their supply lines to the eastern and southern parts. The capture of Vilnopole will allow the Russians to continue upwards towards Shevchenko, where they similarly also have control over the eastern flank of the town. The main advances of the Russians are here in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region this time around, where the Russians are moving closer towards Odradne. They have managed to capture several portions of the first lines moving northwards from the previously captured positions along the fortified lines. The Russians bypassed some of these fortified positions, cutting off one of the supply roads to the forward positions of the Ukrainians. The objective of the Russians is to reach both Komar and Odradne and start the fighting over these towns. It's reported that the Russians are closing in on full capture of Bahatir. This will allow the Russians to move alongside the main highway towards the flank of both of these towns as well. This is why the Russians are moving upwards along the Mokrieli river line and the forest lines to reach these towns for a combined assault from the northern and southern flanks, allowing them to completely isolate these towns. The town of Komar is a larger town with the Mokrieli river line to the west, which means although the Ukrainians have a strong defensive position in the area and it's also located on the high ground, the Ukrainians would have a difficult time supplying them once the Russians capture Odradne and Bahatir, opening up the road towards Komar. The town of Komar itself is located on the low ground along the river line, while the Russians are occupying the high ground to the south of Odradne and east of Komar. The Russian objective here is to gain full control over the high ground, which is to the east of the river line, which will allow them to gain the advantage over all of the towns that are along the river line. The Russians will then gain control of the river line itself by taking advantage of the high ground, which will allow them to then flank the fortified positions along the border area. Based on that, we can see that the Russians will be moving to capture Bahatir and Odradne, move onwards towards Komar, isolating it from its supply line to the north, moving along the river line to the north, gain control over the settlements along the river line, and crossing over along the main highway to gain control over the towns on both banks of the river line, all the way down towards Fedorivka, flanking the fortified positions from the rear and gaining control over the high ground and the main highway all the way to the border area. The Russians also continue their advances north of the Wuja river line, where they're advancing along this forest line that drives through all the way from the north of Fedorivka to the south of Bogdanivka. The Russians looking to advance alongside it to the southern flank of Bogdanivka to complete the encirclement of the town, gaining full control of it and moving onwards towards the border area to the west and along the forest lines to the south, which will allow them to gain control over the northern flank of these fortified positions and also to gain full control over the high ground north of the Wuja river line, where the positions of the Ukrainians are located alongside the high grounds, the fortified positions, while the town themselves are located on the low ground. Same with the Bahatir in the southern flank of the river line. We see based on this that the Russians will look to gain control over the high ground and then move onwards towards the flank of the fortified positions, gaining control of them, which will allow them to gain control over all of the towns alongside the river line. The Russians are also moving along the high grounds here near Kotlyarivka and Turitske towards the border area, allowing them to cross over and cut off the highway, taking advantage of the high ground to the east of it. With this, we can see that the Russians are moving here west of Turitske in the direction of the highway to cut that off, at the same time as they are looking to gain control over the high ground north of Oleksivka to Dashne, as well as cutting off Bogdanivka from the south, all while advancing alongside Bahatir, where they are assaulting the city, advancing in the direction of Odradne and Komar to gain control over the highway. And we can see that the objective of the Russians is to gain control over the area connecting Kotlyarivka through the border area and down towards Komar, following which fighting will take place over the remaining towns alongside the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. Further north, the Russians have managed to advance in between Donetsk and Pokrovsk, where they are continuing the advances along the main highway to gain control over some fortified positions in the area, fighting over the fortified positions southwest of Novolenivka, and fighting over some fortified positions along the highway. The Russians are here moving along the highway northeast of Novopoltavka to gain control over the highway from Beresivka in the south to Novolenivka in the north, to have a better supply line to supply the forward positions along the highway. To do this, they are lacking control over the fortified positions here southwest of Novolenivka and to the northwest of the town, following which it will allow the Russians to start fighting over Novopoltavka, gaining full control of it, allowing them to gain control over the river line as well, moving up in a northern direction along the fortified positions and in the rear of the fortified positions, overlooking the pocket here in between Donetsk and Pokrovsk. The Russians also made additional advances in this direction, fighting over fortified positions and the first lines in the area, where they're looking to gain full control over the pocket itself. The Russians are fighting mainly in the direction of Romanivka and near Alexandropol towards Syria, where the Russians are looking to cut off the remaining parts of the pocket and encircle the Ukrainian forces near Staromykolaivka and in the pocket here to the south. In the northern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians have continued advances west of the Serebets river line, where they have managed to gain control over the first lines to the north of Kolidyasi as they secure the northern flank of the town. They still lack control over the remaining forest line to gain control over the northern flank, which will allow them to gain full control over the town and move onwards towards the fortified positions to the southwest and to the west of it. The Russians also managed to advance in the direction of Ritkodub, where they managed to gain a foothold in the eastern parts of the town, gaining control over the first street and moving alongside both the northern and southern streets along the town itself. The Russians will likely advance and expand their offensive operations to the north and south of the town to gain control over the first lines and the flanks of it to improve their ability to gain control over the town. Gaining control over Ritkodub and Kolidyasi will leave only Selena Dolina remaining under Ukrainian control, which will allow the Russians to then gain control over a significant enough buffer zone from the Serbia rail line for a larger concentration of forces, with Nova as a supply hub. Further offensive operations take place to the north and to the south, where the objectives are to expand the bridgehead further, connected between the southern and northern bridgeheads, and also to expand further in the western, southern, and northern directions. In the Chernihiv region, there is a small advance by the Russians as they managed to gain control over a toilet at the border crossing, a border checkpoint alongside the Russian-Ukrainian border. Based on this, we can see that the Russians are expanding offensive operations within the Chernihiv region. They already control 3 towns alongside the border area. This is an area that is isolated by a river line. This means that the Russians have allowed the front line to merge more with the natural barriers here in the area. But this is a direct assault towards an open area, which could indicate some DRG operations or potentially some scouts moving deeper into Ukrainian territory. The objective of this could be to have some more information, drone operators, and sabotage units deep within Ukrainian territory. It is unlikely that the Russians will launch any large operation here in the Chernihiv region. There is, however, a possibility that the Russians may want to create a buffer zone similar to the Sumy and Kharkiv regions, where they already hold some territory of the Ukrainians. This is simply to discourage an offensive operations by the Ukrainians into the Bryansk region. The difference between the Bryansk and Kursk region and Belgorod regions is that Bryansk is much more forested, much more difficult to launch larger scale operations where they can catch a lot of territory from the Russian forces, especially now that the Russians have fully manned the border areas. However, if the Russians going forward are looking to launch a new offensive in the northern section of the front line, then taking a look at the highway connections, gaining control over Sumy will allow the Russians to move in the direction of Kiev directly, but gaining control over the highways along the border area will allow the Russians to have a much more secure and expansive supply network for their forces, as well as an additional route into Ukrainian territories. Would be extremely beneficial for future Russian offensive operations, as we can already see with the offensive operations on a much smaller scale within the Donetsk region. However, all of this is speculation. The true purpose of this could simply be a distraction or something else. We do not know. We just know that the Russians captured the border checkpoint. With regards to the ceasefire, that was a deadline yesterday, midnight to today, where the EU, together with Zelensky, said 30-day ceasefire, unconditional. If you don't accept it, Russia, then we will put massive sanctions on you. The deadline passed and no massive sanctions took place. Turns out the EU is too scared to put sanctions if the United States is not supporting those sanctions. And so far, it seems that the United States is delaying their own until the May 15th meeting between Zelensky, Trump, and Putin. Well, that is at least what is being suggested. We do not know whether this will take place or not. Putin first suggested a peace deal meeting in Turkey, where Zelensky then responded, "Sure, I'll go ahead and join you in this meeting, but you have to come yourself as well." So it would be a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. Then Trump commented, "That is a great idea, and if you guys are meeting, then I might just come along and visit as well," because he is also in the Middle East right now. He just landed in Saudi Arabia earlier today. So based on this, we can see that there may be a large-scale meeting between Trump, Putin, and Zelensky taking place in Turkey. We'll negotiate a peace deal. We may also simply be a bluff by Russia. They do not want to send a delegation, or they'll send a small-scale delegation. Then Zelensky says, "I was going to go there myself. I proved that I wanted to make a peace deal, but since Russia does not respect me, then I'll just not respect them." Send either a small delegation or no delegation at all. And then Trump is going to be mad because they left him hanging, stood him up. I don't know. The point is, it's likely go one or the other way. Which way it goes, we don't know. The Russians are really the ones with the initiative here, because we can see that Europe and Ukraine are very desperate for some sort of deal, whether it's a ceasefire or peace deal, while the United States is pressing heavily for one. Everyone naturally supports an end to the war. However, Russia definitely wants it on their terms, while Ukraine definitely wants it on their terms. So we are still at the same impasse. We just see that Ukraine is struggling much more than they used to a couple of years ago. And this is a trend that continues, and considering the heavy pressure Europe is putting on Russia to accept some sort of ceasefire, we can see that Ukraine, it may be close to a breaking point, especially if a large-scale Russian offensive takes place. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out our Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.